Well, in the climate of conflict in Eastern Europe, a number of senior retired defence and security personnel have written an open letter to Australian politicians. They call for a number of things, chief among them, though, to make the security risks posed by climate change a key focus in the federal election. They're calling themselves the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. It's made up of 17 former high-ranking personnel. One of those is retired Deputy Chief of the Air Force, Air Vice-Marshal John Blackburn. He joins me now, and I have checked. I always check. I'm just going to call him John today.
G'day, Tom.
Thank you for your time. It's an interesting call. Talking about climate change is the biggest threat when we've got what's happening in Ukraine with Russia, China. I mean, North Korean nukes will be on the news again soon.
Absolutely.
Why is it the biggest threat?
It's because no matter what we try and do in the short term, this is going to get a lot worse. And we've seen what's happened with the floods recently and the bushfires beforehand. And this is going to continue to build. And that doesn't just affect us in Australia, it'll affect everyone around the world. It's going to have a security impact. When people can't get food or water in other countries, they migrate, things fall apart. So it's a global security risk. And we have to address it because it's going to take much more effort to prepare for what's coming.
So does that sort of indicate wealthier nations, and we've got a lot of land and different areas will become less and more inhabitable perhaps in Australia, that we might be able to adapt if we were just our own country, but if there's chaos in our region, that affects Australia?
There's two things. What you have to do if you know a crisis is coming is prepare for it. So let's remember what Air Chief Marshal Binskin said at the Bushfires Royal Commission. Unprecedented is no reason to be unprepared. And we haven't been prepared for the bushfires or floods. We weren't prepared for the pandemic, all of which was predicted. So in Australia, we've got to get ready for what's coming at us and prepare for it. And that's even separate about reducing emissions. But also, if we address it sensibly and we do the emissions reduction, that is a way that we can also address our energy security problems. So don't deal with it just as climate. Think about what our national security issues are, and smart moves on emissions reduction through renewables actually helps us improve our fuel security.
And I want to get to that in a moment, but do you think that's the thing that perhaps sharpens minds the most? Because science is an incredible thing. There'll be different ways we can adapt. There'll be great technology available, lifting houses up. This is the stuff we can afford. But proper chaos in our region, millions on the move, even things such as boats heading our way again, refugees just saying, I want to get to this place, my region can't handle it. Is that the sort of stuff?
Yeah, because if you look at some of the analysis...
defence mind?
Absolutely. So if you look at some of the analysis of what climate change could do, for example, to Indonesia and the surrounding waters, their dependence upon the sea for food, if that gets fundamentally affected, people are going to have to start moving. And it's not a couple of Navy boats that's going to stop that movement. If we're talking about mass migration because of it, and we've seen that happen in other parts of the world, this is a problem that's going to be something we won't be able to deal with.
Okay. So you mentioned fuel security, that this is a separate issue that can be dealt with by reducing emissions.
Yes.
What do you mean by that specifically?
Okay, over the last decade, we've increased the amount of fuel we import. So about 90% of our fuels are imported. We've gone from 7 refineries to 2. And the subsidy for those refineries runs out in 2027. So probably by the end of this decade, we'll have no refineries, everything's imported. Now, the only way you deal with that, because we still need fossil fuels for decades, we still will be some import dependence, but can we get a lot of our transport and logistics off imported fuel? And you can do that, it'll take time, by seeing how renewables and also how Australian-produced biofuels and other, say, things like gas to liquids, can be done to address it. But renewable technology, electric vehicles, hydrogen for larger transport, eventually ammonia is going to be used for shipping. We need to move into that area rapidly because it will reduce the demand on the fuel we get.
So any vehicle in Australia that doesn't necessarily have to rely on fuel, petrol as we call it, if that's shifted off, the sooner the better for our security, even putting aside emissions and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely. So when you start to think about the security side of it, but it's not just defence, how our whole society works, the large-scale trucks that are going everywhere. We are going to need fossil fuels for fundamental things in our society for decades. So if we can bring as much off the import dependence as possible, it gives us a better chance to deal with supply chain interruptions.
Does that, and I know there's debate within this, but does it actually increase the importance of gas? We have a lot of gas.
Gas, as has been discussed a lot, is a transition fuel. There is no way that we can go 100% renewables, for example, by the end of the decade. It's going to take time. But you know what we need? We need a strategy. There is no clear strategy here. It's a technology-led roadmap. Technology enables, people lead. So we don't have a coherent transition plan, and also that's the other problem, we don't have a national security strategy that is a part of. So we're sort of making it up on the fly.
I mean, part of our fuel reserves we have, theoretically, they sit in the US. This concept of this is how we meet the supposedly International Energy Agency requirement, right? You're meant to have, I think, depending, I always get stats sent to me when I talk about this matter on, depending on how many days you need is whether you meet the requirement.
Yeah, so
we don't literally have it here stored.
But also that figure that gets bandied around by the minister is a bit of, let's say, embellished fiction. What's important for our security is what do we have in Australia? It's about 3 weeks of diesel and 4 weeks of petrol. Now, the IEA is a separate thing. It's designed that countries who are member countries can release oil to the market to control prices in a crisis, like is happening now. So we're the only member country that doesn't meet our requirements. We did put 1.5 days of oil into a US reserve purely to be able to be released in a crisis. It's nothing to do with domestic security. So when we talk about these figures, the important one is what do we actually have here that we could use? And it's about 3 weeks to 4 weeks with petrol.
All right, well, given this current situation, we might find out how good our security is in the next few months. John Blackburn, thanks for your time today.
You're welcome, Tom.